Today's video is a recent interview I did with Dr. Dan Cleather. Dan is a lecturer at the University of St Mary's in Twickenham, where he's also the course director in the Masters of Strength and Conditioning. Now, although Dan is an experienced strength and conditioning coach and academic, he actually started out his training in mathematics and went on to work in financial services, which I think gives him a really unique insight and mindset when it comes to forces, mechanics, biomechanics and everything related to strength and conditioning. It enables him to look at all the literature and all the ideas pervading the industry through a different lens. So in this conversation, we get into talking around the force vector theory, some of the misunderstandings people seem to have there, force velocity relationship, and everything got to do with forces mechanics that you need to know as a strength and conditioning coach. Now, unfortunately, the connection wasn't the best, so we didn't capture the video for this interview. We have the audio only. So for those of you who really enjoy my handsome face, unfortunately, you're not going to see it for the duration of this interview. If you enjoyed this interview today, maybe consider sharing it with some of your colleagues across social media, and make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can stay up to date with all the latest videos. So let's get into it with Dr. Dan Cleather. So it's a pleasure this evening to be joined by Dan Cleather on the podcast. Thanks so much for giving up your time at the moment. I know you're on paternity leave at the moment, Dan, so I can imagine life is hectic for you. So I really appreciate you giving up your time this evening.
No worries. Thanks for having me on.
Before we get into this evening's conversation, just to frame it for the listeners, you have what is probably a bit more of an unorthodox route into the strength and conditioning world. So if you'd like to give people just a bit of your background of where your career started out and how you transitioned into S&C.
Yeah, sure. So I did a maths degree at university, just because I was good at maths at school, I guess. But I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And coming out of university, I kind of fell into investment banking, which I didn't like very much. And then I kind of came across this, profession of S&C, after about a couple of years and realized that was what I wanted to do. So then that was probably, sometime around 2001, and there wasn't really very many opportunities to kind of learn that trade in the UK. So I went to the States. I studied a master's at California State Long Beach, and volunteered in the weight room there, and kind of trained up that way. And then my first proper job was it was quite fortuitous, because just as I was finishing up my master's, the EIS were recruiting their first kind of wave of recruitment of their kind of junior strength and conditioning coach position. So I got one of those, moved back here, and then that's how I became an S&C coach.
Fantastic. And then obviously now in your current role, you oversee the master's program in St Mary's University, Twickenham. So quite a diverse background, I must say, for an S&C coach. There's not many S&C coaches with such a strong background in maths and financial services. And this kind of in-depth understanding of maths, do you think that has been very beneficial to you as a strength and conditioning coach, and maybe giving you a bit more of an insight into the applications of biomechanics and understanding forces and stuff?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it probably gives a couple of things. Like, mathematics education is a training in a very specific and logical way of thinking, and that's certainly a useful skill set at times. Although, kind of nowadays, I fight quite hard against that tendency and try and not be so rigid in my thinking. But yeah, the training of doing a maths degree is excellent. And then, yeah, I guess in terms of when you talk about mechanics, in sports science, a lot of people who are biomechanists come from it because they studied sports science or biomechanics. Whereas, yeah, I think so you have kind of biomechanists who are very much applied scientists, but maybe don't, in many cases don't have as firm a grasp on the actual, the mechanics. the mathematics behind what they're talking about. So yeah, it kind of gives another perspective, I think.
And I think that unique perspective in the past while has led to you, Dan, kind of challenging some of the dogmas. I won't say even the dogma would be too strong a word, or some of the misapplications that people have just taken for granted and extrapolated within sports science and strength and conditioning. And that's what I want to cover tonight, this general area of forces. And I think when we use that word, often it's misunderstood or misapplied by strength and conditioning. So the whole relative concept, or what the idea and principles behind force is, you think in the S&C world that is a poorly misunderstood term?
I think that the area is not well understood, and kind of, there is a lot of confusion when coaches try and use mechanics. And the reason for that is that the words that we use in mechanics, which in mechanics have very precise definitions, are also words that we use in our everyday lives where they don't have very precise definitions. And so that, is bound to cause confusion, especially if someone isn't, very acutely aware of the risk there. So kind of, I don't think force is the most misunderstood word, but I think power is, because you have something like, or in mechanics we have work and we have power, and kind of, if I say power to you as a layperson in the street, then what that conjures up to you, if I say, okay, that's a really powerful athlete, you think that they're really strong, that they're capable of moving, a weight fast, something like that. It will mean different things to different people. But actually, when we're talking about power in mechanics, well, power is the rate of doing work. And so it's a very precise definition. And I think a lot of coaches calculate power because they're interested in the qualities that are represented by that word as it's used in kind of the common vernacular. But they don't really have a good understanding of, okay, well, what the calculation itself is giving and whether that's actually giving you precisely what it is that you think it is from the common meaning of that word.
Yeah, and I think one of the areas we'll probably see that, and we'll come back to kind of some of the force relationships we want to talk about, but now that you mention power, we often see athletes and strength and conditioning coaches, yes, one of their main tasks to want to make their athletes more powerful, and as you say, they might misunderstand that. And one of the measures of power we often see people using is just a simple peak power test. So do you think that maybe that misunderstanding of what power actually is has led to people just testing peak power and believing that if that improves, that it's just an overall indicator that their athlete's ability is improved?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, absolutely, I'm sure that the reason that peak power testing is so popular is because, people want their athlete to be powerful and they think that that's what they're measuring there. That measurement of peak power is probably, in most cases, isn't the best measure of whether an athlete is, in inverted commas, powerful, whatever we mean by powerful, from the common language.
And in terms of from peak power, so if we're not going to measure power using peak power, what benefits or what usable data do we get from a peak power test? And maybe if we're going to use other measures, what should we use instead? Should we measure things like, say, impulse, or should there be another measure that we're using?
Yeah, so like it depends on the skill and the sport. But most of the time in the weight room or, in S&C practice, when people are measuring peak power, what they're really interested in is, okay, the explosive abilities of an athlete. So kind of, how high can they jump? How quickly can they change direction? Peak power doesn't give you or doesn't have as a strong relationship with those performances as some other variables. And so, yeah, you mentioned impulse. Like there's a direct relationship between the amount of impulse that someone presses and their change in velocity. There will be quite a reasonable to good or a good relationship between power and someone's change in velocity, but it's not as tight a relationship as you'll have with impulse. So yeah, in those sorts of cases, impulse or variables that have to do with how good the athlete is at impressing impulse are better variables to track. Where power is more useful is probably in sports where we're interested in energy, because there's a direct relationship between energy and work, and so kind of in sports like, say, cycling or rowing, power is a very, very important variable because there's a direct relationship between the performance factor.
Fantastic. And just so the listeners are clear, because I know, as we've seen, the terminology can be quite confusing. Do you mind, if you don't mind, Dan, just explain to people what the difference at a fundamental level is between impulse and power or peak power measurement?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is a bit involved, but essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to get some idea of how much force an athlete expressed during a movement. Okay, so if they're doing it on a force plate, okay, well, we have the instantaneous force measurement that we can see at any time, but that's just at a split second. And what we're more interested in is, okay, well, how much force was expressed over the whole movement? And so kind of there's two ways, or with regards to the conversation that we're having, there's two ways that you could sum up the total force. And it's easiest to do this by thinking of graphs. So first of all, let's think of, okay, you've got a force time graph. So how force is changing over time that's coming out of the force plate. The area underneath that force time graph is then a measure of how much force we've expressed. And so, okay, if the movement is longer, it'll be a bigger area. If the forces are higher, it'll be a bigger area. So that's one measure of total force, let's say. And so that measure is impulse. The other measure that you could do, which is a lot less intuitive, is that you could sum force. You could plot a graph, which is force versus the position that the person was in. Okay. And so it's a force distance graph. And then same thing that because as you're doing a movement, you're also changing position. So instead of plotting, okay, force by each time position point, you're doing force by each position that they're in. And then again, you could sum the area underneath that curve. And that gives you some sort of measure of total force. That measure is called work. And then where power comes in is the rate of change of doing work. So kind of this is where it's kind of a little bit ironic that people are so enamored of power as a concept, because it's intuitively appealing from the common language. But when you actually look at what it means mechanically, it's not that intuitively, it's not that intuitively obvious at all, because you're kind of you're summing force over distance, which is a bit of a weird thing. And then you're taking the rate of change of that. So it's a much more complicated variable.
Thanks for explaining that, Dan. I know I certainly in the past have fell into that trap as well. And again, you just say it's the common tongue power just being associated from just a kind of intuitive way, you do think, okay, well, if I measure power and I want my athlete to be powerful, it makes sense. But as you said, kind of coming at it, when you actually understand the mechanics, it can open up your eyes. And I suppose one of the other areas that you would have caused some debate of recent times in, and it's an area that's still quite debated in the literature between different academics, is the force vector relationship. So ideally that some movements translate better or transfer better into vertical based movements, where others translate better into horizontal based movements. So what is your thoughts or ideas around this whole force vector relationship?
Yeah, so I feel kind of as we're having this conversation a bit of a fraud, because you're asking me as if about my ideas in these things, and I don't think there really are. They're kind of or ancient ideas, and then they're kind of ideas that periodically are revisited in the literature. So for instance, if we were talking about power before, and there's some great review articles out there that argue that power isn't the most important variable to look at, and they'll state exactly the same reasons that I have been, and then and then when you come to the force vector theory as well, the force vector theory is just a misunderstanding of the mechanics, largely, I think. So kind of the basis of the force, or what people are trying to achieve with the force vector theory, is they're trying to find a basis for evaluating if exercises are specific to a given movement or not. And what they say in the force vector theory is, okay, they want to classify certain movements as horizontal and certain movements as vertical, and then if an exercise is horizontal or vertical, then they say that it's more specific to it. And again, it's something that, or in this case, it's something that makes intuitive sense to someone who hasn't got a good training in mechanics. But when you kind of pick away at it, there's a bunch of kind of illogical assumptions within it. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'll continue, Dan.
Yeah. So the main. So if we're talking about evaluating the specificity of an exercise to a given skill from a mechanical point of view, there is a method that's within the literature for doing that, and it's just and this is a method called dynamic correspondence that kind of appeared first in the Russian literature, but then was popularized in the West by Mel Siff. And dynamic correspondence gives you a set of different criteria that you can use to evaluate if an exercise is mechanically similar to a sporting skill. And it's not the be all and end all. There's other things that you could do, but it's a effective process that has stood the test of time. But one of the things that you have to appreciate if you're using dynamic correspondence, and which people misunderstand when they kind of get seduced by the force vector theory, is that largely this idea of horizontal or vertical relative to the global frame, i.e. relative to the world, it is arbitrary. We say, this is vertical and this is horizontal. But that's not really that important to the athlete. What's more important to the athlete is whether something is horizontal or vertical relative to them. So I don't feel like I've explained that very well, but kind of, if I'm standing upright in a room, then my local coordinate system is aligned with the global coordinate system. Okay, but if I then started falling over, then my local coordinate system would be changing relative to the global coordinate system, such that by the time I hit the floor and I was lying on the floor, now vertical according to me is horizontal according to the global. And why this is important is that largely in movement, our strategy for directing the forces is that we change the orientation of our body to project force in the direction that we want to go. So if you want to accelerate sprinting, you lean over. And by leaning over, that then allows you to propel, or to exert more force horizontally relative to the global coordinate system, but relative to the athlete, it's still vertical relative to the athlete. It's still, they're still expressing force along a line that goes from their head to their toes.
Yes, that makes perfect sense because, again, as you said, intuitively from the naked eye, you're like, okay, well, they're going up and down in one movement and they're going side to side laterally in another movement where, yes, if we're looking at it, we're like, well, that's clearly vertical and horizontal. But when you look at from what directions the athlete is actually expressing force, it doesn't change all that much. And I suppose why then, one of the arguments you'll often see is people bringing up, well, when we look at some of the literature, we see certain studies showing that squats lead to better vertical jump height increases, where hip thrusts lead to better sprint increases. And they'll argue, well, that's because one expresses force horizontally and the other vertically. Is it that's the case, or is it more just that the musculature, range of motion, and say contraction types or whatever in the hip thrust just lend themselves more in terms of transfer to sprinting?
Exactly what you say. So kind of you've got a dubious criteria, which is the force vector theory, that's being used as an explanation, but there's other explanations, and so you've given some of them. But yeah, if you take it back to dynamic correspondence gives you some other criteria that are much less dubious. So things like, okay, yeah, what's the range of motion of the joint when it's expressing its peak force? And yeah, quite conceivably that's has a better correspondence for, say, hip thrusting to sprinting than for back squat to sprinting. Similarly, kind of just things like where the emphasis is in terms of which musculature you're using, and what's important in that skill. And so yeah, there's kind of many more kind of mechanically less dubious reasons that you could go to there, which seem to be more compelling arguments for the differences that people might have measured.
And then why, Dan, do you think that the force vector theory, kind of a lot of people who would be, say, influential in the S&C world would have kind of thrown their weight behind it? It's probably, I know if I was to make an opinion on it, I'd say it's a much easier idea to get behind that. Look, if we want horizontal movement, we do horizontal exercise. It's much easier rather than going into what is the contraction type, range of motion, muscle involved in what movement I'm trying to improve. Why do you think so many people have fallen behind this idea? Is it just a lack of basic mechanics, as you say?
I think so, and advocacy by respective people. But like it is kind of from the position of a university lecturer. It's been a bit of a weird time since these ideas started being promoted within the literature and being published within the literature, because 5 years ago, to say to say kind of something like, oh yeah, back squat isn't very specific to a rugby scrum because one's horizontal and one's vertical, is quite a common mistake that students would make if they're asked to write an essay evaluating dynamic correspondence. And 5 years ago, that would have just been marked yeah, this is wrong. Like, and the student wouldn't get a very good mark for it. And yeah, it would just be simply treated like a misunderstanding of the mechanics and of dynamic correspondence. Now, as an educator, that's not really fair on a student to mark that as wrong, because they'll be reading, recent literature, which is, making the same mistakes. But I'm I mean, there's some subtleties around it, but largely I think it's just a mistake.
Yeah. And again, we see it. I know we've recently had Franco and Pellizzeri on the podcast, kind of showing the same thing around the acute to chronic work ratio, how when something starts, that a lot of kind of mistakes can get carried from one study to another and not picked up from just a lack of understanding of fundamental stuff that maybe not most sports scientists are adept in. So maybe it's just another, as you say, you coming from a much more deep understanding of mechanical, and other people who in the literature have picked this up may have just a deeper understanding of mechanics rather than just a pure S&C background. So also within this conversation, I'd like to cover, Dan, and something that I've seen you debate, and maybe just kind of another pet peeve of yours, and that would be the force velocity curve or force velocity relationship. So again, this is something that velocity based training and everyone kind of it's a staple within S&C coaches to get their nice curve and work, and that to influence a lot of their program. And so do you see the force velocity relationship as something else that's misunderstood within strength and conditioning?
Yeah, I mean, it is very, very much so. And there's quite a lot of depth in this as well. I think that there is a force velocity relationship, but it's very specific to a certain tissue, and that is that there is a force velocity relationship in muscle. That is that, there's this hyperbolic relationship that people will be accustomed to seeing, which is in muscle, if it's contracting slowly, it can be high force, and if it's contracting fast, it will be low force. And the reason for that is simply due to the nature of how muscles create force. If you're talking about muscle contraction, there is a force velocity relationship. However, people hear this force velocity relationship and then they assume that, okay, that's a universal law, which it isn't. It's simply a property of muscle. That kind of assumption that it's a universal law then causes difficulty. The other reason why it's a problem is because the idea of there being a relationship between force and velocity is also intuitively quite easy to accept, and it's something that kind of it's pretty well known that that people who don't have a mechanical training will assume that there's a force velocity relationship. And that is things like, okay, people just have a kind of gut feeling that, okay, if you're pushing something hard, it'll be moving fast. And if you're not pushing something very hard, it will be moving slowly. And people aren't alone, in making that mistake. I mean, that was what Aristotle thought as well. And the world thought until kind of Newton came along and proposed that actually the universal relationship is between force and acceleration. That is, if you're pushing something hard, it's accelerating fast, but its velocity could be slow or it could be fast.
That is, when people think about force velocity, it's the force velocity curve to do their test, working up percentage 1RM and get a nice curve. And one of the things we often hear people advocating is they'll base exercise selection on where they believe it falls upon the curve, and also that we should be training all areas of the curve to improve an athlete, that we should get and kind of shifting upwards and to the right, ideally. So what would your take on those ideas that seem to pervade in S&C?
Yeah, so in terms of kind of, training to shift the force velocity curve to the right, like I don't kind of, I think that the practice that people are describing when they talk about that is sound, because what they're saying is, okay, I want my athlete to get strong, and I want my athlete to be able to move fast, and somewhere in the middle of that, I'd like them to be able to move quite fast with a heavy weight. Like, I think that's, those. That kind of goal for training is entirely sensible, but yeah, the theoretical basis for it is a bit weird and doesn't really bear much critical scrutiny. No, so for instance, on the classic force velocity curve that people will present is that they'll have, okay, at the high force end, they'll have a squat, then say at the middle, they'll have of kind of intermediate force and intermediate velocity, they'll have Olympic weightlifting. But I'm not sure that squatting does result in kind of, I mean, it's hard to compare like with like, but I don't believe that, peak force in squatting will necessarily be higher than peak force in weightlifting. And certainly not the kind of dramatic drop off that you'd need for a hyperbolic curve. So I kind of like, just taking that simple example there on its own, it's kind of like, well, those two exercises I don't think would trace out the curve that people have in their mind. But that's not to say that those two exercises shouldn't be in a training program. And then kind of with regards to velocity-based training, again, I don't have any problem with it as a practice. Like I think there's some very clear advantages to kind of tracking velocity in terms of engaging athletes and in terms of helping coaches who aren't desperately experienced in understanding, okay, when an athlete's starting to get fatigued, or in understanding how an exercise should look. However, I think that the main reason why velocity-based training, works is because, okay, well, actually, if you're tracking peak velocity, what you're looking at is the change in velocity and from zero. And if you're looking in, there's a direct relationship between change in velocity and impulse. So actually, your velocity score is just a proxy for impulse, which is actually a very useful variable to be tracking.
Fantastic. And then just to kind of wrap this up in terms of, I know one question that people often will have is this idea that a solid rounded athlete will not have a weak area of that force velocity curve when measured, and we kind of talk about the limitations of that. So is that an argument you see put forward, or kind of an idea that you see a lot of students having?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I don't have a pat answer, off the top of my head. I think that athletes do things in different ways, and that kind of, like if you go back to sprinting, you can have, very powerful, there's that word again, but very powerful fast athletes, and then you can have very bouncy fast athletes, and their ability to perform certain exercises will differ, but they'll probably all be strong, and they'll probably all be pretty bouncy, and they're all certainly fast, but some will be stronger than another.
Perfect.
I'm just ducking the question, really.
That's fine. I put you on the spot, and again, it's probably a question that there is no clear answer to, or need a bit of contemplation to come up with any insight on that. So, I suppose to wrap up on this kind of whole idea of force and different force relationships, if you were to kind of give 2 or 3 key takeaways to S&C students or young S&C coaches around kind of misconceptions or misunderstandings around basic mechanics and force, what would they be? What should you say people should have a really solid understanding of to be an effective S&C coach?
Yeah, I think that people want to, think deeply about impulse and think about, okay, how do athletes generate impulse, and how do the constraints of the sport affect impulse? Okay, so kind of we're trying to get as much area as we can under the force time curve. How can we do that? We can have higher forces on average, or higher peak forces, and that will generally be where most people's mind will go. More sophisticated people might think, okay, well, if we have a greater rate of force development, and what that means is, okay, if the force that we're expressing, if we can increase that quicker, then we'll have more area under the curve. And the reason for that is that, okay, if the force that you're expressing can increase faster, then as that curve starts going up from 0, the gradient of that curve will be steeper if you have greater rate of force development. So if you have greater rate of force development, then you'll have more area under the curve. But then the other way that people really won't think about at all often, where you can have more area under that curve, is, well, you could just have that curve being wider, so you can express impulse for longer. So if you were expressing impulse for a longer amount of time, if you're expressing force for a longer amount of time, then you also have more area under the curve. And again, people's intuition will probably say, but time is limited in sport, but often it won't be. And so kind of when I want to sort of talk about manipulating variables in terms of impulse, I like to kind of contrast volleyball versus basketball and volleyball versus beach volleyball. So if we do volleyball versus basketball, first of all, well, yeah, in basketball, in many situations, you'll want to leave the floor quickly. So if you're jumping to get a rebound, it's whoever gets to the height of the ball first wins it. So you don't want to be spending time on the floor. So in that case, yeah, you're not going to increase impulse by increasing the amount of time that you jump. However, if you consider a volleyball player, and if you consider an outside hitter in volleyball, well, the ball is set to them somewhat high, or if they're very good, it won't be set that. If it's a very high level of volleyball, it won't be set that high, but they still know where the ball is going to be, and they can time their run up to coincide with the point where they want to hit the ball. And what that means is actually they can spend a very long time jumping. And so that, they're, an outside hitter, one of their key strategies for creating more impulse will be that they're a skillful jumper. And what a skillful jumper is someone who can actually spend more time in contact with the floor before they leave the floor, expressing force. So that's kind of, so that comes from understanding impulse. And then the other one that I think is interesting to talk about when you're having this discussion is, okay, well, contrast indoor volleyball with beach volleyball. And in this case, let's talk about blocking. So in beach volleyball, there's a problem with jumping, and that's that you're on sand. And the problem with sand is that when you push on it, it goes away. And so it's pretty hard to put high forces through the ground when you're playing on sand, which isn't a problem that a player will have indoors. So the way that people jump indoors blocking is a jump as you're more used to seeing, but essentially they will bang into the floor quite hard and, generate high rate of force development, high peak forces, and, have, a certain duration for their jump. You can't do that on sand. You can't bang into the floor and, get, rapid and high peak forces. And so what blockers will do on sand when they're jumping is that they'll compress, they'll go into virtually a full squat before they jump. And the reason they do that is, well, if their if their counter movement goes a lot further down, then the duration of the jump is much longer. And so, they can't express as high forces, but they do them for longer. And that's how they maximize their jump. So that's not that's a long explanation of something and not really a takeaway, but it's meant to exemplify that, if you want to be a great strength and conditioning coach, and you're thinking about mechanics to improve yourself, that I think that making sure you understand impulse and in a deep way, and thinking about how impulse is expressed in sport skills is kind of the area to put your attention.
Yeah, it's certainly fascinating, Dan. I think that example you gave about volleyball is truly fascinating. And as you said, yes, it was a long explanation, but I think it gives people an idea of the level of thinking that they should go into their program and kind of how they coach their athletes to a certain degree. Because I know that certainly, as you said, on the surface, it doesn't make sense. Why would we want to be there for longer? But when you actually boil it down and observe the sport, it is very applicable. And a couple of words,
if you sorry, and there's some real training take homes when you think about that as well, because you've kind of got like, okay, indoor, they're banging into the floor, like it's a more reactive expression of strength through a shorter range of motion, whereas on sand it's through a larger range of motion and it's more pushy. So indoors it's bouncy, on the beach it's pushy, and kind of those imply there'll still be certain, commonalities amongst training, but certainly if you're simply looking for jump height, that probably will manifest itself in some differences in the way those athletes will train.
Yeah, it certainly is fascinating that for the same quality in what a lot of people on the surface say is the same sport, just the court or the surface is a bit different, can lead to quite huge variations in the implications for training. So definitely great insight there for strength coaches. And a couple of the words that were popping up there, Dan, and I'll leave you after this. I know I'm conscious of time now, but was peak forces and rate of force development. And the reason I want to get into this is I've seen you talk about this before, and I like your kind of general views and insights on this. And when people think of those words, rate of force development, peak forces, Olympic weightlifting and weightlifting derivatives often come to mind. And there seems to be a certain, I won't say it's a full schism within the industry at the moment, but there seems to be a lot of pushback in certain camps around the use of weightlifting in, say, team-based sports, in their benefits in rugby, people saying too time-consuming to teach, too complex, and that we can get the same bang for buck using other less complex and easier to teach exercises. So where do you fall on that kind of argument? And I know the answer probably doesn't lie in the middle, as we shouldn't be in distinct camps. It's probably a blend of the two. But that kind of argument that, look, we don't need our athletes to Olympic weightlift, or that there's not much value to it for athletes, that we should just use other jumping exercises or other easier to teach exercises.
Yeah, like, so yeah, I my opinion is that there's lots of great training tools, and that Olympic weightlifting is one, and that and there's lots of other ones as well. What in terms of this debate, what my perception is, though, is that there's some people make some assumptions that I don't agree with, which they then use to get to their conclusions. And so, the most common one of those is that, people say, okay, Olympic weightlifting is complex and it takes a long time to teach. Therefore, it's not worth doing it. And my problem is with the assumption that it's complicated and takes a long time to teach, because when I hear someone saying, it takes, so long to teach someone how to weightlift, that just says to me that they're a crappy weightlifting coach. And so kind of, I always think with, or in many cases, rather than blaming the exercise, or blaming the athlete for not being able to do anything, but for not being able to do something that, it's probably worthwhile, looking at yourself as well. I think that some of the reasons that are advanced for people to, opine that weightlifting isn't a good thing to do, I just just represent that they're not very good at teaching weightlifting, I think. And I don't think it's, there's lots and lots of there's lots and lots of tools out there. But I do personally feel that weightlifting is a pretty nice stimulus. But it does have its disadvantages as well. So it is about kind of, as a coach, you do weigh up pros and cons and, risk reward, et cetera. But I do think that in doing that, we just also have to be a little bit careful about the assumptions that we're making.
And some of the assumptions that people make is, one of the big advocates for Olympic weightlifting is the high rate of force development, and triple extension, say, is often we hear touted. Do you think that the same adaptation stimulus is achieved, say, in a clean that we get in what is commonly used instead as a trap bar jump with a trap bar deadlift or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, those seem pretty different. They're both great exercises, but one is loaded jumping, and I think weightlifting is loaded jumping as well. But the difference in weightlifting, and this does also depend on someone's style, but the kind of loaded jumping with a trap bar will be kind of, for me, a more knee dominant exercise, whereas when you weightlift, it also has more of a hip component to it. And especially, again, kind of like, okay, in the contrast that I gave between, a volleyball outside hitter and, a basketball player while they're, playing in the game, is, okay, well, one of the principal things that a volleyball outside hitter will do that results in kind of, or is one of the reasons why they spend more time on the floor, is that they will be more flexed at the hip and have a more inclined trunk when they jump, and they'll lever from their hip more to jump. So it's a more kind of hippie jump. Whereas kind of, okay, if you're jumping in basketball, I mean, basketball players are quite skillful jumpers often, so they can use different strategies. But if they're doing a quick jump, it will tend to be more bouncy and more knee dominant. For me, one thing that kind of weightlifting can give you is, okay, the kind of more hippie jump kind of quality. I think that you get that from weightlifting, where you don't really get that kind of hippie, snap, kind of, I mean, it's kind of like a hip hinge, but you don't get that hip hinge, from a trap bar deadlift. It's a squat pattern. So yeah, I think, again, I don't think that they're training the same thing.
Again, it comes back to the common theme of understanding the mechanics a bit more, and looking deeper rather than just what intuitively looks correct at the surface. So before I ask you the last question, Dan, and it's been an absolutely insightful conversation so far, if people are looking to follow your work or get in touch and look at the work you're doing at St. Mary's, where's the best places to follow you or find you and contact you?
I'm on Twitter quite a lot now. I'm on Dr_Jump_UK. So kind of, that's where I'm active on social media. If you want to find me on email, if you go to the St. Mary's website, you can find me there pretty easily.
Fantastic. And so that brings us to the final question, Dan, the same one that every guest get asked. And this, you can take whatever approach you want with this question. It doesn't have to be about strength and conditioning, but what would you say is the biggest mistake you've made so far, or the biggest learning experience you've had that has changed the way you approach your career or your life as a whole?
Yeah, so I mean, my biggest regret professionally is very, very clear to me. And it is that kind of, while I was working for the EIS, like the EIS, certainly when I worked for them, very much had a culture of, or what in terms of trying to influence skills coaches, there was this culture of softly catchy monkey. That is that you're kind of just going to hang around for ages until the coach eventually asks you your opinion, which, works for some coaches and doesn't for others. But those coaches who it would work for, will probably start asking your opinion from day one anyway. And those coaches who wouldn't ask your opinion, doesn't matter how long you kind of like hang around, they're not interested. And for me, kind of, in one sport in particular, like if I was to do my time again, that I would have kind of, there were things, not necessarily unsafe, but that, there were I just thought things could be a lot better. And I just, kept waiting to be asked. And, if I was to have my time again, I would have, gone to battle over, or ultimately gone to battle. I mean, that's not inciting that should have been a day one thing, but kind of, after a certain amount of time has passed, I think that, it's appropriate to kind of, or it would have been appropriate for me to kind of take a stand. And then kind of when I reflect on that experience, one thing that I've kind of, where I've developed in life is kind of, I'm comfortable being in conflict with people now, whereas I wasn't before. And I find actually that kind of people value me more professionally if I just say what I think. And so I kind of tend to do that quite a lot more now and not worry so much about, the outcome and whether that's going to result in me being in conflict.
It's a fantastic answer, and I think a lot of students and young coaches could definitely take some insight from that to be more assertive and confident in their approaches with coaches. So it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you tonight, Dan. I know the listeners will take a lot of value away from everything we discussed. So thank you so much for giving up your time. I really, really appreciate it.
No, thank you very much. It's been great.